The military operation in the skies over Libya to halt Gaddafi's attacks from opposition locations is now under NATO command. But is it all too late? Symbolic of how the West's policies have failed North Africa and the Middle East. That's our BBC World Debate from Brussels. Well, welcome from me, Nick Gowing. Even as we meet for this debate, much is uncertain and changing fast across many countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Everywhere, pressure for reform and an end to decades of autocratic rule. The intensity and speed of the demands stunned regional leaders and governments. It caught them all off guard and often left them powerless. Leading Western governments were also wrong-footed. Policies were left in shreds. The struggle to find a new coherent position exposed, driven by the question, what now?
The future of Egypt will be determined by its people. It's also clear that there needs to be a transition process that begins now. That transition must initiate a process that respects the universal rights of the Egyptian people and that leads to free and fair elections.
President Mubarak's continued leadership is critical. It's his opportunity to write his own legacy. He's given 60 years of his life to the service of his country. This is an ideal moment for him to show the way forward.
The people of Libya have made themselves clear. It is time for Gaddafi to go.
I've asked the Ministry of Defence and the Chief of Defence Staff to work with our allies on plans for a military no-fly zone.
There's a lot of, frankly, loose talk about some of these military options, and let's just call a spade a spade. A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya.
Given that a no-fly zone would start with bombing raids on Libya, is that wise after what happened in Iraq?
Obviously, the Gaddafi's regime's threat to bomb civil population and cities is unacceptable. That's why France approved the planning by NATO of what is called the no-fly zone.
NATO is not looking to intervene in Libya, but we have asked our military to conduct the necessary planning for all eventualities.
In our view, the Gaddafi regime is over. Its legitimacy is over.
One thing is for the German government absolutely clear. We do not want to get sucked into a war in North Africa.
We're only in the early stages of what is happening in North Africa and the Middle East. These events are already set to overtake the 2008 financial crisis and 9/11 as the most important development of the early 21st century.
Well, joining me here to lead a host of views among a large number of foreign policy experts at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum are straight from the European Union summit of heads of state and government close by, Baroness Ashton, the High Representative coordinating foreign policy for the EU's 27 member nations. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chair of its European Affairs Committee. And Nabil Fahmy, Dean of the School of Global Affairs at the American University in Cairo, a former Egyptian ambassador to the United States. Welcome to you all. Well, just before we start the debate, let me just do a reality check with all of you with the question, is the West doing the right thing with the current military action in Libya? Unscientific, but what's the view in this hall? Who agrees with what is being done at the moment? And those against? I would say there's a vast majority in favour of the current military action in Libya. Baroness Ashton, any doubts at the moment about what is happening in Libya?
No doubts about the action that we've taken, because it's very significant to see that the people of Benghazi, I believe, have had a bloodbath averted. I believe, though, that we have a lot more to do in terms of planning for the future of Libya, and that work needs to begin.
Jeanne Shaheen, Senator, do you have any doubts about what's happening in Libya at the moment?
It's very clear that Muammar Gaddafi has lost the confidence and support of his people, and I think we intervened to avert a mass killing of the citizens of Libya.
Nabil Fahmy.
Well, I think it's important to take into account that the Arab League actually acted first by refusing to receive Libyan representatives as long as the military actions continued against the civilians. Furthermore, they supported the idea of a no-fly zone in order to ensure the security of civilians. It then went to the Security Council. So in that respect, there is support. However, there is concern in the Arab world regarding the use of the military beyond the no-fly zone. In other words, taking actions on the ground.
Baroness Ashton, is there any clarity at the moment about what happens next? You've just come from a meeting of heads of state and government.
Well, indeed, and as Nabil says, one of the critical parts of this is the relationship between the role of the United Nations, and I was talking with Ban Ki-moon, as I do most days, with the Arab League, with the Musa and the work that the Secretary-General does, and with the African Union. At the moment, what we're looking to do is to establish how best we can move forward for Libya, to try and support those who are calling for democracy, calling for Libyans to be free, calling for a future that includes their own elected government. And already we're beginning to think, say, especially with the United Nations, this is a UN-led approach as to how we can do that best. And we'll continue those contacts.
Now, there are many foreign policy experts here. Let's hear from you, your views, your questions, your thoughts. Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, Professor of European Studies at Oxford University.
Thank you. I had a question to Lady Ashton. I wanted to broaden it out slightly. We've seen on these video clips a picture of understandable confusion and indeed disarray. Could I ask you what you think the European Union in particular, and perhaps even you personally, got wrong or could have done better over these 3 months in response to the Arab Spring?
I think one of the most challenging parts of this was that all of this happened in a very unexpected way. You know, we can trace back and look at some of the things that should have told us perhaps things were changing. But I remember at the beginning of this year, the focus of my work was on Ivory Coast. It still is. I was thinking about some of the issues in our eastern neighbourhood. Of course, we were working closely with the Arab League. We were engaged with our southern neighbourhood, as we call it. But what happened, the speed of it, the changes that took place, I believe were very difficult to predict. So probably what we got wrong was not doing enough to think more about the future and to look ahead at the trends, to look ahead at how things could change very rapidly. Most importantly, we've got to be sure that we're backing democracy and freedom absolutely 100% in every policy that we have.
Jeanne Shaheen, the view from the Hill in Washington.
I think what we're seeing is the most significant change in world events since the fall of communism in the Soviet Union.
So you agree with Foreign Secretary William Hague in Britain?
I do in that respect. And I think we will see it play out differently in different countries throughout the Mideast. But I think, again, the point that Baroness Ashton has made, that we should be in the position in the West of supporting people who are crying out for the kind of values that we value in the West, for human dignity, for respect, for the opportunity to participate in their governments. And wherever we have the opportunity, that's what we should be supporting.
But just to be clear, Washington's been totally taken by surprise, essentially, by this.
You know, I was in Egypt last summer with a group from the Senate, and we met with a number of civil society leaders in Libya, or in Egypt, and they were among the most disaffected about the future of potential for democracy in their country of anyone we met with in the Middle East. So based on what we were hearing from Egyptians themselves, from other people in the Middle East, it's understandable that we were taken by surprise.
Ambassador Fahmy, should the West have been so nonplussed and wrong-footed? Did they miss significant signs, given the enormity of what has happened in so many countries, including your own?
Well, I think we all missed some significant signs, but there were things that we should not have missed, and it wasn't a complete surprise. Anyone who looked at demographics in the Middle East, 56% of our population, which is a quarter of the Middle East, is 25 years and younger. If you add to that communications and access to information, the pressure or the push towards better governance is a common thread throughout the Middle East, even though the confrontational theater in each one of the countries is different. So in that sense, there was nothing surprising about that we're going to get into a political confrontation somewhere in 2011, 2012. What was surprising was how quickly and how strongly it happened. My point, however, is a step further than that. Frankly, and I say this from my perspective as a former diplomat, the West has tended to ignore the Arab Street. Not that you have to react to it, but you have to understand it. And I would argue that as we move more and more towards a democratic system, that will be even more important for us, but equally important for you.
Let me press you on this issue about acting fast enough. Should we have acted quicker and clearer and more decisively? What's your view from Washington, Senator?
I think, given the events and the way they played out, it would have been difficult in the U.S. to have acted without support from the Arab League, without support from the international community. And so, you know, in hindsight, it's always easy to say we should have known this was going to happen. But the reality was we didn't see it coming. And so it's important to try and respond to events as they happen.
Let's go to other questions here in Brussels. Robin Niblett, the director of the think tank Chatham House.
The High Representative, Baroness Ashton, used the phrase that we must kind of back freedom in every case just now, I think, in answer to the question. And I think Senator Shaheen said, you know, wherever the opportunity is, we need to step forward. But the fact is that change across the Middle East is highly diverse. And it strikes me one of the biggest risks we face, certainly in Europe and in America, is that at some point in the next weeks or months, we're going to be accused of double standards. You know, in Libya, our red line, using military force against civilians, full range of tools, diplomatic, sanctions, no-fly zone, arms embargo, all have been used against them. But have we thought through our red lines for the other crises? What happens if Bahrain, if protests continue to be put down very seriously? What happens in Syria if military force is used?
Nabil Fahmy, to just build on what Dr. Niblett has said, do you see double standards in the way the West has been handling this, not just in recent weeks, but certainly in the months and years before this?
I see a lot of double standards in how the West has been dealing with the Middle East for many years in the past, be that in terms of how it handles the Arab world and how it handles Israel, for example, on issues of occupation. But I don't think you can sort of apply exactly the same model, exactly the same response to every domestic situation. There is one common thread throughout the Arab world, a call for better governance between the people and those governing them. That's clear. But what's provoking the demonstrations and, frankly, the solutions will differ, whether it is in North Africa towards Algeria, Morocco, or Tunis, in my own country, in Egypt, or in the Gulf. It's not one model fits all, but one of the core call, which we as Arabs have to respond to, is better governance between the governed and the governing.
Senator, do you feel the danger of being accused of double standards on this?
We should start with whatever we do. There are going to be those who are going to criticize and those who are going to support it. But I think what the former ambassador pointed out and what you pointed out in your comments is that we have different situations in each country. And we have to assess what the situations are in the individual countries and try and address those as they appear. And I think if we have some fundamental principles that we start with, that's very important. And the other thing that is very important is we need to hear from the region what they want to see happen. We heard from the Arab League about the no-fly zone in Libya and the importance of the international community taking action. I think it's important for us to hear from those regional organizations from the countries there who say, this is what we would like to see happen in response.
Baroness Ashton, the idea of double standards, the danger of double standards here.
You know, when I was listening to the question, one of the things that we have to always bear in mind is that we have to find a way of balancing what I call the engagement versus the isolation approach. And that over the time I've been in this role, just over a year, I've had to grapple with that on a number of occasions. And the challenge will always be, how do we make sure that within that spectrum of the level of our engagement, we keep true to the values that we hold, and that applies in our relationship with the United States, and it's something we talk about with the United States, is where do we engage? How does that engagement actually try and support the values we have, recognizing the most fundamental aspect of this, which is that the people want to decide their own futures, and our job is to support them in doing that, not for us to say, here we come, we've got lots of good ideas.
But let me press you on this. I mean, this issue of double standards, what do you do now about countries which have relied on repression to maintain stability, given what has now happened in recent weeks? After all, they, in many ways, have been kept in power because there's been a tacit acceptance by European Union countries, by other countries, including the United States, that repression is the way to create stability. Is that now a dead principle or not, Senator?
I don't think we ever ought to support the idea of repression to create stability.
But that's what's happened in recent weeks and months and years.
Well, but I'm telling you, I don't think we ought to do that.
So it's the end of that policy then, is it?
I don't make the policy all by myself. I'm telling you what I believe. And I also think that we should be in the position of trying to assist people in the countries to try and help them accomplish what they want to accomplish. One of the things that I think is very interesting, looking at the uprising across the Middle East, has been that they have not taken on an anti-U.S. or anti-West persuasion, that they have not been the result of terrorist instigation. And so I think that's very positive. These are efforts on the part of people throughout the Middle East to ask for the right to participate in their governments.
Nabil Fahmy, I have to put this to you. You were an ambassador. You represented your country around the world in several postings. But in the end, your government was really maintaining its power through repression, which was backed by the United States and tacitly by many other countries. Do you now feel uncomfortable about that? Do you feel that way of thinking now has to change outside of the region in order to ensure there really is political reform?
First, let me just clarify a point about the Arab League, and then I'll answer that question. The Arab League supports a no-fly zone. They do not support attacking land targets, just for the record so that everybody here understands that. Now, on the issue that you're raising, I've always believed that as we move towards democracy, it would happen from within rather than from outside. And let's all be realistic. Foreigners will pursue their own national interest and deal with whomever they feel serves that national interest. It doesn't have to be either or, though. You can deal with governments as we will deal with governments that we don't agree with. But at the same time, you can invest in something that helps the long-term objectives. I would have invested much more, if I was a Western, in education throughout the Middle East, because that's where you really build the capacity for the Middle Eastern people to develop their own democracies, not a democracy that's coming in from abroad.
Well, let's get another voice from Egypt. Mahmoud Salem, you are a blogger, an activist, a writer, and an investment banker. What's your reaction to what you've been hearing?
The US aid, had a long and prestigious history in Egypt. Long history, and it has always aimed to create a more efficient state. But we were a dictatorship, which always kind of led to us becoming a more efficient dictatorship, if you will, which isn't the intended consequences, I'm guessing, from the United States government. Well, now we're a democracy, and why doesn't the US, for example, show goodwill towards an economically unstable Egypt right now by saying, for example, that we're going to offer a free trade agreement, or activate the free trade agreement with Egypt starting from next year with the onset of the election of the new president? Because I think that would send the right message to the Egyptian people and the people who are in the economy who are concerned right now about the stability of the country.
And while you have the microphone, let me press you. Do you feel comfortable about the relationship that Western countries have had with the former leadership of your country or not?
This is realpolitik. They had to deal with them. They had to engage. I didn't feel comfortable with them, but what could they do? I wouldn't have wanted them to actually impose any kind of sanctions or act militarily against the country, because this is my country and I love it. I think they've tried their best, honestly speaking.
Senator.
On the free trade agreement, I assume that we will be willing to talk about a whole range of things that might be helpful to Egypt, and that those conversations will continue. And I appreciate what you said about the challenge of dealing with the situation as it existed, because I talked about my visit to Egypt, and it was the only time I've had a chance to be in your country, and I was very impressed with the people that I met. But one of the things that we had a chance to do was to try and press some of the leaders on opening up, particularly you had elections coming up last December, about trying to be more open, let the international community in, let country observers in to see what was going on, open it up to more political participation, and the response we got was negative. So, as you point out, it's something that is homegrown, and we need to respond to what's happening now.
Nick, if I could just jump in for a second. I live 100 yards from Tahrir Square, and the first day there was a curfew, about 9 or 10 kids came into my apartment after the curfew. And naturally, I suggested to them sleepover and the sorts. Their answer was, why? Who applies the curfew? We own the country. It's a completely different environment that the youth started, society supported them, but we then, now, all of us, have to create the building based on that revolution.
Do you want to come in, Lady Ashton?
Just to support what was said about the importance of trade, I mean, my point about that would be, as a former trade commissioner, is that, you know, one of the biggest things that we can all do to support this whole neighbourhood, it's where we can, as the European Union, the United States and beyond, is not only the opening of markets to enable trade to be freer, but also helping countries to be able to take advantage of those markets. One of the greatest challenges that people don't realise is not the opening of the market, but if you can't produce the goods that we want to the standards that we wish to apply, then it's a waste of time. And so trying to make sure that we can do that, which is something I absolutely believe in and tried to do very much as Trade Commissioner, will be a core bit of what Europe can do to help.
There are many people who'd like to come in. Let me just pick up on 3 or 4 people who are wanting to come in on these particular issues. Let me go to Professor Hans Binnendijk from the National Defense University in Washington.
I would like to go back to Libya and ask where this NATO involvement might go. I think the hope of most people in this room is that the no-fly zone plus, as we might call it, would lead to a military overthrow of Gaddafi. Now, if that doesn't happen, where are we? Are we just going to continue the no-fly zone for a long time? Or will we reach a point where we might need to introduce ground forces? Where is this operation going to take us if the no-fly zone does not lead to Gaddafi's overthrow?
Any other voices who want to just talk about Libya specifically? Let me go there, please.
Ambassador Fahmy, I understand you don't represent the Arab League, but you seem comfortable explaining their position on Libya. So I wondered if you could answer or explain what I view as a fundamental inconsistency, which is it's unacceptable for Gaddafi to slaughter his own people using aircraft, but it's acceptable for Gaddafi to slaughter his own people using tanks and howitzers.
What you're hearing there is the kind of questions that there are, particularly about where this is now going, and also the attitude of the Arab League at the moment. Ambassador.
Well, I actually don't see a contradiction in the position of the Arab League at all. They were the first to say that we will not deal with the Gaddafi regime as long as he's killing his own civilians, even before the Western community. So let's be fair to the Arab League. Secondly, yes, they are worried about overextending the mandate of the no-fly zone. That's a reality. And the Arab League is a composition of 22 different countries. So it's not one country deciding on what they can do. I was just simply explaining the position of the League because I was the first to have mentioned it in my intervention.
And also the issue of how far intervention is likely to go now. Baroness Ashton, can you enlighten us on the mood you detect, certainly among the nations that you represent in Europe, given that 2 of them have been leading, particularly on the no-fly zone, militarily?
Yeah, I mean, I think the framework that the European Union is working is, of course, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973, and that's very clear about what it's seeking to achieve, which is to make sure that people are safe and they're not being attacked by Gaddafi and his forces. The European Union's position, as you know, is that he should leave, he should go. and that we should move forward to a new government. And the NATO operation, and that's all been happening. You've already expressed the fact that I've come out of the European Council, so it's been going on while I was there, and I wasn't emailing at the time. But as I understand it, they are taking over that. That's about logistics and the fact that you need that support.
The question is, where's it going?
Well,
what are the political concerns, and what is the political will? Where's it now going?
The political will is to enforce a no-fly zone, to keep people safe. And I think when people meet next week in London, it will be to look at how we now move forward and support the future for Libya. But this changes day by day, and we have to make sure that the will, which is very clearly there to support the operation, continues.
Senator.
Well, I just wanted to also point out that the UN resolution specifically prohibits an occupying force in Libya. So we have to remember that while we're talking about the no-fly zone and protecting potential victims of any mass killings, that it also very specifically says we will not go in those countries, the UN and the West, that support that resolution as an occupying force.
Does anyone else want to pick up on this?
I think there needs to be more realism from all participants, including the ones sitting at the panel. There is a fundamental contradiction in U.S. and EU policy. On one hand, President of the United States and you, Lady Ashton, have said Gaddafi's got to go. On the other hand, we have voted for a no-fly zone which will leave Gaddafi in power. It will not solve the problem. It will, of course, provide protection against humanitarian protection, but it will not solve the major problem, which is the fact that he will remain in power. My question to the panel is, are you willing to support actions beyond the no-fly zone which would actually turn the tide, or could turn the tide, in the struggle, or not?
Very clear question. Would you support it? Senator.
Well, what President Obama has said is that the United States, that Gaddafi has lost the support of the Libyan people, but that we are supporting the UN resolution which stops at providing an embargo to prevent arms from going into the country, establish a no-fly zone, and protect potential citizens from killing. And it doesn't go further than that. And I think at this stage, that's where we are. The no-fly zone is in place, the embargo is in place, and we need to see what happens next.
As Jeanne was saying, we are in a position where there is a very clear framework for our action, and I think we should never underestimate how important it is that we're working with the Arab League, and we're talking with the African Union, and we're trying to work out how best the people of Libya can achieve what they clearly want. It's what they want that matters in this. And what was being obvious to me is what they have said very loudly and very clearly is we want change. And therefore what we're doing is trying to be in support of that and helping them to achieve their objective.
Let's get a few more voices. A voice down at the front here, specifically on Libya.
Thank you. Barbara Lee, Member of Congress from the 9th Congressional District of California, representing Oakland and Berkeley, California.
What is the perception in the area you represent about what is happening and the intervention?
Of course, the perception is, one, we have to address the humanitarian crisis.
Is there support for it?
But there's very reluctant, first of all, people are concerned about a military intervention that could go on and on and on. And of course, many of us coming from places such as my district are concerned that Congress had no discussion or debate about this before the action.
But there was an absolute urgency, and that's central to the way governance is going to have to handle this in future. You can't hang around too long because of what is happening in a place like Libya.
You can't hang around too long, but as members of Congress, we represent the people of the United States who have to have a voice in military action as it takes place, regardless of the urgency. We could and should, I believe, have been called back into session to pass some sort of support or non-support for this military action.
Let's get some more voices, please.
My name is Petra Stienen. I used to work as a diplomat for the Dutch government in Syria, and my friend Bente Schneller worked for the German government. We're both now outside of the government, and we're very concerned for our friends like Mahmoud, also bloggers, some of them in jail, some of them very concerned. In Syria, at the moment in Damascus, people are being arrested. And people are actually very hopeful that the European Union can play a positive role before things get out of hand. So my question, Lady Ashton, is when are you traveling to Damascus?
I think it's not just about me. I mean, I think I visited 20 countries already this year, and I spent a lot of time.
But we're talking about
traveling.
the timing.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I mean, it's important to let's get the reflection of this right. First of all, of course, it's important that we keep putting pressure on in Syria and elsewhere, and our delegations there. We've got ambassadors there who are talking with the government every day, not just on their own, but in conjunction with the member states. There are 27 foreign ministers from member states. We are, if you like, a team. It doesn't have to be me. We've got people out all the time who do a fantastic job on behalf of not just their own country, but on behalf of Europe. And if you look at where they've all been, you'll see that we've been trying to reflect the policies and strategies of Europe by travelling to places, but also using the resources we've got. So in the last 48 hours, I've been talking to our delegations in Lebanon, in Syria, right across the Middle East. They've been going and putting statements to the government. They've been sending messages very firmly to the government about what we want to see. They're in touch with people right across the country and so on. We're doing everything that we think we can at this point to put pressure on. Because you're absolutely right. We want people to have democracy and freedom, and we don't want them to have chaos. And the ability to be able to support change in a way that doesn't lead to chaos is really important to us. And that means we have to have people all the time in all the different countries working. And actually that's what we're doing. A lot of it very quietly, as you would expect.
But if it's quiet, does the regime, does the president, does the prime minister, do they listen to quiet diplomacy, or do they just ignore it?
Well, I think you have to be quiet and you have to be loud. I mean, it's not either one, it's both. The point I'm trying to make is a lot of the discussions and messages go on because we ring people up, we talk to them. There are foreign ministers in this room who I know will have spent the last few days talking to contacts right across the neighbourhood. They don't always put it in a press release. They don't always give a press conference.
All right, well, let me test that immediately, if I may, Lady Ashton. We have Carl Bildt, who's the Swedish foreign minister. Who have you been calling to try and stop things getting much worse?
No,
well, hang on, that's my question to you, Carl Bildt.
That was your question, but I'd like to call the Arab League, because it was pointed out that the Arab League position taken in Libya was absolutely critical. That was what led to the UN Security Council resolution, and that was led to the situation that we are in now. But Syria, news reports are coming in the last few hours of people being killed in Latakia and Deira, say that they are right and that things are getting out of hand. Will the Arab League stay quiet, or will the Arab League follow the rather daring and courageous course it took on Libya? I think that is going to be decisive. I'm prepared to call a couple of people, but...
Well, have you called them already?
No, because this has happened in the last few... I mean, things are slowly... no, sorry, they're not developing slowly. They're developing very fast.
Well, but let me press you, Minister, because you've been involved in Bosnia-Herzegovina. You're a High Representative. You've been a Foreign Minister. You've been a Prime Minister. You know the limits, but also the potential for making things happen and preventing things getting much worse under the responsibility to protect.
Right.
What can be done? What's the way in which the international community now has to mobilise, and mobilise much faster?
And that is why I am, in this particular case, brought up the position of the Arab League. Because I think what happened with the Arab League was absolutely critical. I think it would have been, frankly speaking, somewhat difficult for the West, whatever that is, without the support of the Arab League, to take prompt action. And if things are now going downhill on more places, I think we would first like to see what's the response of the Arab League. And as critical as that was on Libya, as important I think it will be in Syria or in the other places. So and I'm quite certain, Kathy and others, the engagement with the Arab League is absolutely critical, and the role that they will take. It's their part of the world, not ours.
Well, I have a question. Who elected the Arab League? You know, who appointed Amr Moussa as, you know, the head of the Arab League? You're talking to the Arab League, you're talking to all the dictators that we're removing one by one. I think by next year, the Arab League is going to have introductory meetings, in which people get to meet the new leaders. So, thinking about collaborating with the Arab League, whether or not they're going to do something, naturally, they don't want troops. Naturally, they don't want you to remove dictators because that means that they're going to be next. So listening about engaging the Arab League is kind of, funny because that's naturally what they would do. They would let you, yes, no-fly zone, but that would mean bombing. Well, no, don't bomb. What are you supposed to do?
Nabil Fahmy, a league of dictators.
Well, again, I think, frankly, when you see a trend in the Arab League, in the Arab world, moving towards more democracies, we should encourage that. And we have to, and I underline again, we have to do this ourselves. Democracy is not going to come in by importing it. What you can help us do is capacity building ourselves. Now, I'm not condoning in any way, nor will I, excessive use of force against demonstrators, demonstrating civilians. That's not going to be part of my position, at least.
And I just want to point out that in addition to quiet diplomacy, there are a lot of countries, the United States, in Europe, and in the Arab world who have condemned what has gone on in Syria, in Yemen, where citizens have been fired upon. So this is something that we need to do quietly and we need to do openly, and that's happening. And the fact that the international community, with support from Arab states, took action in Libya should send a very strong message to other countries throughout the region.
Let's go to Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie Slaughter, until a couple of months ago, you were head of policy and planning at the US State Department. You're now back at Princeton University. Did you see all this coming when you were in policy and planning? Are policies in place in the US State Department, or were they when you left at the end of January, to prepare for this?
We had plans for every country. We saw it all coming, and Secretary Clinton has them now. A little more seriously.
Now tell me the reality.
Yes. Well, I think it is clear that the speed of this has taken us all by surprise. But to be fair, both Secretary Clinton and President Obama, I think the EU, for the last 2 years have been talking about things like internet freedom, youth policy, development as an equal pillar of our foreign policy. That's exactly the kinds of policy that are speaking to the ability of youth across the Arab world to be able to communicate with each other by standing up for internet rights. It's recognizing that they are 60% of the population. As Secretary Clinton always says, we must be doing our diplomacy directly to those people as well as to governments. And development is critical, as you heard from Ambassador Fahmy, and I think more generally, ultimately, this is about education and health and infrastructure and the ability of people to have the same opportunities in Arab countries as elsewhere. So I think we weren't prepared in the specific, but we have been seeing these trends coming, and you've seen the Obama administration emphasizing dimensions of foreign policy that you have not seen before, precisely in reaction to the appearance of these trends.
Given the speed at which what has happened across multiple countries, what has to change in the mindset to make sure that we're not having another debate like this in a few weeks or months, saying why did the international community not act quickly enough, hopefully with American leadership?
I think there's some things we can do, but I actually think we've acted incredibly quickly. If you look at things like Bosnia or in Rwanda, we didn't act at all. In Bosnia, it took years and years. It took a month, and in 1 week, we've gone from no action to a UN resolution to stopping Gaddafi's forces outside Benghazi to actually now returning the ability for rebels to retake some other cities, to having various members of Gaddafi's government in Tripoli reaching out, and we don't know what those conversations are, to now in 1 week having NATO take over from the US. So I actually think by the standards of government, it's been remarkably quick action. What I do hope is that we are engaging now in the hopes that we don't get to the level of violence that would require us to face a decision as we've had to face in Libya. And that's not a matter of force, that's a matter of diplomacy, public and private, and I'd like to hear the Arab League declare some principles, the UN principles, EU principles, US principles that say these are our red lines.
Senator, do you sense an enormous sea change in perception of what has to be done and how quickly in Washington, or not?
Well, I think what so many people have reflected in their comments is that we realize through a number of painful lessons in the case of the United States, that addressing these kinds of situations is not just about military action. It's about economic assistance. It's about the kind of governance. It's about the kind of long-term investment and relationship building that we need to do if we're going to have the kind of countries that people are yearning for around the globe.
Let me pick up now with the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Bulgaria. What's your view?
I think we should call a spade, and this is about democracy, it's about economic opportunity, and it's about people having a right to be part of their own government. And I think this is a similarity, in a way, to what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in a very different context, of course, in 1989. And then everyone was taken back by the quickness with which the regimes fell. Many questions were asked in the beginning, where is it all going? I remember some were saying that countries in Central and Eastern Europe didn't have a democratic tradition and would probably not be able to govern themselves democratically. Now, all of that seems rather strange when we look at it 20 years later. But today, we're at that point in the Middle East. We're at the point at which people really need to build their own countries. It's not about the Arab League, it's about the Arab nation, I'm sorry. And the Arab nation has said that it doesn't want to be talked down upon by anyone from the outside world. What we can do is, I think, very much, we can help them. We can teach them our lessons. We can tell them what we've done wrong, actually, and what we've done right. And perhaps they could integrate that experience and build on it and avoid making some of the mistakes, at least, that some of us in Central and Eastern Europe have made. And I strongly feel that Kathy and a number of us should be on the first plane to Damascus, really going out there and telling the Syrian leadership it is time for change. And I've actually written a letter to her about this yesterday.
So, Baroness Ashton, that's the second time you've been asked. Do you believe your role is to go to somewhere like Damascus and warn them about the potential for things getting so much worse and the way the European Union is keeping an eye on you?
I think I spend a lot of my time talking to countries, and I've got no objections. Nikolai grew up in Syria, so he has a lot of experience about Syria, which I've used, and we continue to talk to each other. Whether it's and when it's I go, I certainly will go at some point to Damascus. My point was about trying to use all of the resources that we've got, the people we've got there, the people that we can work with, the visits that we make, the opportunities that we take. There have been a lot of people coming from North African countries, the Middle East, through Brussels in the last 2 weeks. I've seen a large number of foreign ministers from Yemen, from other countries.
And are they listening?
Well, I think sometimes they listen. I think what...
Do they take notice?
I hope so. I mean, look, you know, there's no doubt, sometimes to my surprise, that when we make statements, and I've been making statements about what's going on in Syria, what's been going on across the region for the last few weeks, it is perhaps surprising how often I get calls from those countries who've read and looked at every detail of what we say. It does matter. And it matters that we meet them, it matters that we visit them, it matters that lots of things happen. The key thing is to make that fit into a plan that's also got at the core of it what we're actually going to do, because there's always also a danger, and I'm not suggesting that's what Nikolai's saying, that we all run around the world going everywhere, and actually we don't do the work that says this is going to be what the offer is. This is going to be what we're really going to do to make a difference. So we also have to, as well as responding to the crisis and the changes that happen hour by hour at the moment, have a much longer-term vision and a really deep-rooted plan that's going to deliver the resources to those people.
Nabil Fahmy, what you've just heard there from the Foreign Minister from Bulgaria, the fact that there's so much to learn from what happened in Eastern Europe 20 years ago, is that the mood in North Africa and the Middle East, do you think?
We are, at the American University, initiating a program of 23 different events from 1 week ago until summer, to learn from others and also to learn from our own experiences. And we will be inviting a lot of European participants, including from Eastern Europe, to learn from that. But at the end of the day, we have to do this ourselves after learning these lessons. I just want to make one point, if I may. There are two issues here. One, the non-use of force against civilians, which is urgent and immediate. And secondly, democracy building, which we need to do as quickly as we can, but will take time. And I just want to make sure that we invest in both of these, not only in crisis management of the use of force.
And Senator Jeanne, can I just ask you about whether there's a mood up on Capitol Hill in Washington, understanding that enormous events have taken place. There's been a significant change in the ways that we've heard in this discussion and from some of the sound bites right at the beginning of the discussion, that really there has to be a change of mindset in Washington.
Well, I think there's still going to be a lot of conversations in the Congress about what's happening in the Middle East, but I do think there's a recognition that it's important for us in the United States to try and promote those people in the countries who are trying to get more say in their governments, and to do that both through economic means and through governmental assistance, as well as through military intervention in certain circumstances.
Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Nabil Fahmy, and also Baroness Catherine Ashton, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's it from this BBC World Debate, taking place while so many developments are unfolding in different countries across North Africa and the Middle East. Thank you to our panel and all the foreign policy experts here at the Brussels Forum. Thank you for joining us as well. From me, Nick Gowing, bye-bye.